He inherited an old house deep in the countryside, left behind by his late uncle. But in the basement, behind an old wooden wardrobe, he found something no one could have expected to see. Watch how it all ends. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. The call from the attorney came early on a Wednesday morning, when the light was still pale and hesitant over the roofs of Denver. The voice on the line was polite, professional, and short. His uncle Harold Morgan had passed away 2 weeks earlier. There were no other relatives left close enough to claim the property, and in his will, Harold had named his nephew Lucas as the sole heir to his house and everything within it. For a moment, Lucas just stood there, phone pressed to his ear, the sound of cars outside muffled as if the world had briefly stopped breathing. He had not seen his uncle in years, not since the summer before college. But the man's image rose in his mind immediately. His steady blue eyes, the warm smell of varnish and sawdust, the way he could make even the smallest model bridge feel like an engineering triumph. Lucas hung up the phone, but he didn't move right away. His small apartment above the auto shop felt colder than usual. On the counter stood a mug of cold coffee, half finished since before dawn. The air smelled faintly of oil, metal, and exhaustion, the smell of his life these past few years. He was 24, too young to feel old, but every day seemed to bleed into the next. He spent his days tuning engines, changing tires, and listening to the low growl of machines that belonged to other people's roads. Nothing in his world felt like it was moving forward. He had loved his uncle once, deeply, in the way children love someone who listens. Harold had been a patient man with clever hands. When Lucas was a boy, summers meant the drive north to his uncle's house in the Colorado foothills. There, in a workshop that smelled of pine and metal filings, they built worlds together. Piles of Lego bricks spread across the floor, whole neighborhoods rising from imagination. Bridges, parks, houses painted bright with hope. Harold had a rule. Every city they built had to have green space and open streets. A good city breathes, he used to say. If it can't breathe, it dies. Those memories had blurred with time, replaced by the clatter of tools, the routine of bills and deadlines. Lucas had stopped visiting after his parents divorced, then college, then work. Each year, the calls between them grew shorter until they stopped altogether. Now, standing in the dim morning light, the only voice left was that of an attorney reading off the address of a house surrounded by dry hills. He took the rest of the day off from work. His manager barely looked up when Lucas said he needed a few days. There was always someone ready to take extra shifts. He packed a small duffel jeans, a flannel shirt, flashlight, his old toolkit out of habit, and left Denver before evening traffic thickened. The drive south toward the mountains was long and quiet, the kind of road that seemed to erase thought. Sunlight flickered across the dashboard, then faded as the day bled into orange and violet. As the miles passed, memories began to drift through him like old photographs shaken loose by the motion of the car. He remembered the first model town he and Harold had finished together, when he was 8 a block of streets with a little fire station and a pond made of blue marbles. He remembered Harold's laughter when the bridge they built collapsed under too many toy cars, and how they had rebuilt it, stronger this time. He remembered the man's quiet pride in the act of creation, in getting things right not because someone asked you to, but because you wanted them to be right. The highway narrowed, leading into the back roads of rural Colorado. The night deepened around him, and the sky filled with stars. He turned off the main road onto a dirt path marked only by a crooked mailbox with the faint lettering, H. Morgan. The headlights swept over the outline of a weathered 2-story house at the base of a low ridge. The porch sagged slightly, but the structure still looked solid, proud even, the way old houses sometimes are when they've been looked after by careful hands. He parked in the gravel and stepped out. The silence was vast, no engines, no voices. Only the distant rasp of wind across dry grass. The air smelled of dust and pine sap. He walked up the steps, feeling the boards creak under his boots. The key from the envelope fit perfectly in the lock, and with a single turn, the door gave way with a long sigh, like a held breath finally released. Inside, the air was cool and dry, heavy with the scent of varnish, old paper, and time. Dust motes hung in the thin beam of his flashlight. Everything seemed exactly where someone had left it. Coats on hooks, boots lined by the door, a coffee mug on the counter, a newspaper folded neatly beside it. It was as if Harold had just stepped out for a moment and never returned. Lucas walked through the kitchen slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of the table, the grain of the wood worn smooth by years of use. He moved through the rooms one by one. In the living room, shelves were filled with old engineering journals, model train magazines, and thick manuals on circuitry. A half-finished wooden bridge sat on a table, its delicate beams held together with tiny brass pins. On the wall hung a framed photograph of a much younger Harold, standing beside a boy with a gap-toothed grin and a head full of messy hair. It took Lucas a moment to recognize himself. Something in his chest tightened, not quite grief, but a deep ache of recognition. This house was not just a building. It was a map of his uncle's mind, a reflection of how the man had lived and what he had cared about. Every corner seemed a whisper of precision, patience, and the quiet joy of making things work. Lucas carried his bag upstairs and found the bedroom nearly untouched. The bed was neatly made, the closet filled with neatly folded clothes. On the desk stood a single-frame photograph, Harold holding a miniature street lamp between his fingers, smiling at something unseen. Beside the lamp sat a small wooden box with the words, "For later," carved into its lid. Inside were a few mechanical parts, some wires and a note folded neatly in half. The handwriting was steady, careful. "If you're reading this, I hope you're still building." He set the note down and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the faint hum of the wind outside. The message wasn't a mystery, it was an invitation, gentle, unassuming, but heavy with meaning. He hadn't built anything in years, not since childhood. The realization felt sharp and humiliating, as if he'd betrayed something essential. As the night stretched on, he wandered back downstairs and switched on a dim lamp. He noticed the faint shimmer of dust in the air, the stillness of the rooms, and how the shadows clung to the corners like memory itself. On a shelf near the back door, he found a photograph that made him pause. It showed Harold standing beside a wooden table covered in miniature houses, the kind they used to make together from cardboard and glue. Only this time, the table looked larger, more elaborate, almost professional. Behind him in the photo's blurred background, there was something else. The edge of a large structure, possibly a model or a framework, though it was impossible to tell. The image stayed in Lucas's mind as he prepared to sleep. He unrolled his jacket on the couch, too tired to make the bed upstairs. The house creaked softly in the wind, the timbers settling with the night. Before closing his eyes, he looked once more at the faint glow of the lamp and thought of the note. "I hope you're still building." Outside, the hills were silent, and the stars lay over the valley like cold embers. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would start sorting through the rooms, check the basement, make a list of what to keep and what to sell. But somewhere, buried beneath that practical thought, something small and long asleep stirred inside him. A quiet pulse of curiosity, faint but alive. When sleep finally came, it was filled with the rhythmic clicking of gears, the whisper of turning wheels, and the distant sound of a city too small to exist anywhere but in memory. When morning came, the air inside the old house was cool and pale, as if it had absorbed the dawn through its walls. Lucas woke on the couch, his back stiff, the blanket half fallen to the floor. For a few seconds, he couldn't remember where he was. Then the scent of dust and dry wood returned, and the memories of the previous day settled like quiet companions beside him. The note on the desk upstairs echoed faintly in his mind, his uncle's handwriting, calm and deliberate. "I hope you're still building." It wasn't a farewell. It was an unfinished sentence. He stood, rubbed his neck, and crossed to the kitchen. The light that came through the window was thin and cold, turning the dust into a slow, drifting fog. Every surface bore the soft film of time. He found coffee in a tin, still good, and an old kettle on the stove. The simple act of boiling water felt strangely significant, like partaking in a ritual that had belonged to someone else. The kettle whistled with a sound that seemed too loud for the silence of the place. The house revealed itself slowly, like a person reluctant to speak. In the kitchen, utensils were hung in careful order, knives lined up smallest to largest. The calendar on the wall was still turned to March 3 years earlier. In the living room, magazines lay in neat stacks, all about miniature modeling, circuitry, and architecture. Every object, from a cracked mug to a folded towel, was placed with the same patient precision. The rooms had not been abandoned in chaos. They had been preserved. Lucas walked from room to room, trying to map the space the way his uncle must have seen it. The workshop nature of the home became more obvious with every step. The coffee table had been repurposed as a platform for tools, the corners marked with faint burns from soldering irons. On one wall, the paint had darkened in the shape of a large rectangular frame that was no longer there, as if something had once hung there for decades. He paused by the window, looking out toward the dry hills beyond the property. The grass shimmered in the light wind, golden and brittle. A bird landed briefly on the railing of the porch, then vanished into the empty fields. He turned away, his gaze catching on a door half hidden behind an old armchair. It led to a narrow flight of stairs descending into darkness. The air rising from below was cool and carried a faint scent of metal and oil. The basement. He found a lantern by the workbench, one of those heavy industrial ones with a wide handle and glass guard, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the dust as he descended, the steps creaking beneath his weight. The sound of his own breathing filled the tight stairwell. The lower he went, the stronger the smell of machinery became, like an old workshop that had been closed for years but still remembered work. The basement was larger than he expected, its ceiling low and lined with wooden beams darkened by age. The walls were covered with shelves filled with boxes and jars, labeled in his uncle's neat, steady handwriting. Screws, copper wire, microbulbs, motors. Each label was crisp, the ink still black. A long workbench stretched across one wall, crowded with tools, magnifying lenses, and a half-assembled metal frame that looked like the skeleton of a miniature bridge. But it wasn't the workbench that drew his attention. It was the massive, old-fashioned wardrobe standing against the far wall. It didn't belong. The rest of the basement was functional, arranged for building and repair. This wardrobe was ornate, heavy, carved with patterns that seemed older than the house itself. Dust gathered thickly along its top, but the handles shone faintly, as if they had been touched not long ago. Lucas stepped closer, the lantern's light trembling across the surface. The wardrobe stood flush against the wall, yet there was something about the way it sat, too perfectly placed, too intentional. He ran his hand along the side and felt a faint current of cool air seeping through a thin gap between the back panel and the wall. He crouched and shone the light lower. There were fresh screws drilled into the wood newer than anything else around. Someone had fixed this wardrobe into position, as if to seal something behind it. He straightened, a pulse of unease tightening in his chest. The house had been a monument to order, but this piece was different, guarded, secretive. He touched one of the screws with his fingertip. It was cold, too clean. He checked the floor. A faint trail of sawdust ran along the edge, ending in small footprints. His uncle's work boots, perhaps, or someone else's. He couldn't tell. He set the lantern on the floor, found a screwdriver in a nearby box, and began to remove the screws one by one. Each came out easily, turning with a soft, metallic sigh. When he reached the last one, he braced himself, gripped the edge of the wardrobe, and began to pull. The heavy structure protested, its legs scraping against the cement, leaving pale trails of dust. A low groan echoed through the basement as he dragged it inch by inch away from the wall. Behind it, the light caught something unexpected. A narrow wooden frame, half sealed with panels of thin plywood. The seams were uneven, as if someone had closed it hastily. Lucas pressed his ear to the boards. On the other side, he could hear the faintest hum, a sound that didn't belong in a silent house. He found a crowbar among the tools and worked it carefully into the edge. The plywood gave way with a soft crack. Dust poured out, the air stale and heavy. The beam of his lantern pierced the darkness beyond, revealing a narrow passage leading into a deeper chamber. The floor was covered in sawdust and wiring scraps. The hum grew louder, mechanical but rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something asleep. Lucas hesitated at the threshold, his pulse quickening. He thought of his uncle again. The calm eyes, the slow, deliberate movements. Harold had built worlds from nothing, taught him that order was its own language. Whatever lay beyond that opening, it wasn't random. It was meant to be found. He ducked under the frame and stepped through. The narrow corridor bent slightly to the right and opened into a small room. The air was cooler there, with the metallic tang of circuitry. His lantern revealed walls lined with sketches, blueprints, and small shelves filled with miniature parts. A work table occupied the center, its surface scattered with brushes, tweezers, and vials of paint. But beyond the table, occupying nearly half the space, was something that stopped him where he stood. It was a large wooden platform, raised to waist height, covered entirely by what looked like a city. Even in the dim light, he could see the precision of it. Rows of streets, tiny houses with real glass in the windows, street lamps made from coiled wire, and beads of resin. There were cars, trees, even a train track winding along the edge. The detail was astonishing. Every building had personality, a purpose. It wasn't a child's model. It was the work of an engineer, a craftsman. Lucas moved closer, setting the lantern on the edge of the table. A small control box sat beside it, with switches neatly labeled in his uncle's handwriting. He hesitated only a moment before flipping one of them. The response was immediate. A low electric hum filled the air, and the city began to wake. Tiny bulbs flickered to life inside the miniature buildings, casting a warm, golden light. Streetlights glowed one after another. Cars began to move along the streets with mechanical grace, and in the far corner, the miniature train started to glide along its track, its headlights cutting through the scaled-down dusk. The sight stole his breath. The room was alive with motion, slow, deliberate, hypnotic. He leaned closer and could see that the cars moved in perfectly timed intervals, obeying traffic lights that shifted from red to green. The level of planning was extraordinary. This was no hobby project. It was an entire world, designed and maintained by one man's devotion. Then he saw the far edge of the platform. Beyond the neat grid of completed streets lay a section that was unfinished, a bare stretch of plywood, the faint lines of streets sketched in pencil but never built. The edge of the model bore a handwritten note in fading pencil, simple and direct. For Lucas, finish it when you're ready. His throat tightened. He stared at the words for a long time, the hum of the motors filling the silence between his heartbeats. The realization came not like a blow, but like a slow dawn. His uncle hadn't built the city for himself. He had built it for them both, and for the boy who once believed that a world made of bricks and imagination could last forever. Lucas turned slowly, the lantern's glow spilling across the blueprints on the wall. They were detailed schematics of the miniature city measurements, lighting paths, circuits, mechanical schedules. Everything had been cataloged, mapped, perfected, except for that one unfinished section. He stood there for a long time, surrounded by the soft hum of the living model, feeling as though he had walked into a memory that had kept moving without him. Time had stopped for the house above, but down here, beneath the earth and dust, something had continued to breathe, to move, to wait. He reached out and switched off the power. The hum faded. The little city went dark, its lights dimming until only the lantern's reflection remained on the roofs of the tiny houses. The silence that followed was immense, but it wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, of work unfinished and love that had chosen patience over time. When he finally climbed back up the stairs, the first hint of evening had returned to the windows. He closed the basement door gently behind him and stood for a moment in the hallway, feeling the pulse of his discovery settle somewhere deep inside him. Above his head, the floorboards creaked softly, the house shifting with the cool of dusk. For the first time since arriving, he no longer felt alone. The day had ended where it began, with the thought of his uncle's steady hands, the smell of varnish, and the quiet insistence of a man who had never stopped building. Tomorrow, Lucas told himself, he would go back down. Tomorrow he would see how everything worked. Tomorrow he would understand what the unfinished part of the city was meant to be. Outside, the hills turned dark under the rising moon, and the windows of the house caught the faintest reflection of light, as if somewhere deep below, the little city still glowed, waiting for him to return. The following morning, Lucas woke with the strange certainty that the dream he'd just left behind had been real. It was the city alive again, glowing faintly in the darkness of the basement, moving with its quiet precision. Even now, as sunlight crept through the blinds and spread across the floorboards, he could still hear the distant hum that had followed him into sleep. It had not been the sound of imagination, it was memory calling him back. He dressed quickly, pulling on his worn jeans and a shirt, then stood for a moment beside the window, looking out over the empty fields. The morning air was so still that even the weeds did not sway. Somewhere far off, a hawk circled above the ridge, its shadow cutting across the dry grass. The world outside felt hollow compared to what waited below. Down in the basement, the air was cooler, thick with the scent of metal and time. He switched on the lantern and descended, step by careful step. The wardrobe stood half-shifted from the wall, the narrow passage behind it now an open invitation. The thin layer of dust he disturbed yesterday still hung faintly in the air, glowing in the lamplight like golden smoke. When he ducked into the passage again, it was as though the rest of the house vanished behind him. The small chamber at the end looked unchanged, yet different in the morning light. The miniature city stretched out before him on its raised wooden platform, a network of streets, squares, and houses that had once been Harold's secret and now belonged to him. Lucas set the lantern down and stared at it with renewed awe. The perfection of the work revealed itself more clearly now. Every street curved with purpose. Every light pole stood at the same measured distance. Even the park benches were carved from the same thin wood, each one sanded and painted by hand. He ran his finger gently along the edge of a building, marveling at the smoothness. The roofs were made of painted tin, the windows from real glass slides. It must have taken years, decades even, to finish something like this. And yet, it was not finished. His gaze drifted toward the far side, the incomplete sector. The plywood there was bare and unpainted, a framework of unfulfilled plans. The penciled lines marked where streets should have gone, where houses would have stood. On the edge, that same handwritten message waited like a whisper frozen in time. For Lucas, finish it when you're ready. He could almost see his uncle's hand moving across the board, steady, certain, a craftsman's touch unhurried by age. What had stopped him? Illness? Time? Or had he truly meant to leave this part for his nephew to complete? The thought filled Lucas with a quiet, unshakable emotion. Half grief, half responsibility. It was as if the city had been waiting for him all along. He began to explore the room in earnest. There were boxes stacked along the walls, each labeled in Harold's familiar handwriting. He opened one. Inside were tiny lampposts wrapped in tissue paper, their bases marked with numbers. Another box held miniature cars, sleek models of 1950s sedans, small enough to fit on the tip of his palm. There were bundles of copper wire, circuit boards no larger than playing cards, and sheets of painted foam cut into the shapes of houses. On the walls hung blueprints, pinned in precise rows. Lucas stepped closer, reading the faint pencil notations. They weren't just drawings. They were technical maps of the entire system that powered the city. Tiny arrows indicated wiring routes. Small notes in the margins explained light sequencing, motor speeds, gear adjustments. He recognized his uncle's meticulous logic, each decision supported by calculations and revisions. The model wasn't just built to be seen. It was built to live, to move, to follow the rhythm of a real city. Curiosity took over. He found the control panel again and studied its simple layout metal switches. 2 dials, a master lever for power. He reached out, hesitated for a heartbeat, and then switched it on. The room filled instantly with a low, steady vibration. One by one, the city's systems woke. The streetlights flickered to life, glowing with the soft warmth of miniature dusk. The cars began their slow procession down the narrow roads, engines humming with barely audible clicks. A train emerged from behind a hill of painted plaster, its silver body catching the light as it curved along the tracks. The tiny park fountain began to spin, shooting a thread of light reflected through glass beads to mimic water. Lucas stepped back and just watched. The illusion was complete. It was not merely a diorama. It was a world contained within another, bound by order and imagination. The hum of motors became a kind of heartbeat, soft but insistent. He found himself breathing in sync with it. the same way he used to when building Lego cities with Harold on the living room floor all those years ago. The city was alive, yes, but it was missing something, a sense of completion. The unfinished section stared back at him like an unanswered question. He turned toward the table of blueprints and noticed something else. A large notebook bound in brown leather, its corners worn from use. He opened it carefully. Inside were lists, diagrams, and notes written in neat, steady lines. Each page detailed progress reports, material lists, and sketches of building facades. But scattered among the technical entries were personal reflections. Light must move like time, slow, predictable, kind, one note read. Another said, "Don't rush. A city only breathes when every piece has someone's patience in it." At the bottom of one page, he saw a line written in darker ink, dated a year before Harold's death. Lucas used to say the cars should make noise. Maybe he was right. Real cities aren't silent. Lucas traced the letters with his fingertip, the words trembling faintly under his touch. His uncle had thought of him, not in passing, but as part of this creation. This wasn't just inheritance. It was participation, a continuation of something that had never ended. He spent hours that morning studying every inch of the city, tracing the electrical paths, observing how each part responded to the switches. There was logic behind everything. The lighting followed a time rotation between morning and evening. The cars looped through different routes. The trains adjusted their stops according to sequence. Each mechanical sound built toward harmony. Eventually, he turned off the power again. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but the resting of a living thing. The miniature streets glowed faintly in the dim light of the lantern. Dust had settled on some of the rooftops. He brushed it away gently, feeling as though he were waking something fragile from a long sleep. He looked once more at the unfinished section. A ruler, a box cutter, and several small containers of paint lay nearby, waiting as if Harold had set them down mid-task. There was even a half-built structure at the edge, no higher than his hand, its wooden skeleton held together by tiny clamps. He picked it up carefully. It was light but solid, perfectly squared. The edges smelled faintly of pine and glue. He placed it back and stood still, listening to the silence of the room. His heart beat slow and even, matching the rhythm that had once come from the motors. He realized that this place, this room hidden behind the wardrobe, was not a secret meant to stay buried. It was a message. The entire city had been built as a dialogue between generations, an idea passed quietly from one pair of hands to another. When he finally turned off the lantern and stepped back into the passage, the world upstairs felt different. The boards underfoot no longer creaked with emptiness. The air carried a faint hum, as though the mechanical life below still resonated through the beams and walls. Lucas climbed the stairs in silence, feeling that each step carried both weight and purpose. In the kitchen, the sun had already begun to dip low, painting the cabinets in long gold lines. He poured himself a glass of water, stood for a moment by the sink, and looked down at his hands. They were strong, marked with faint cuts and oil stains from years of mechanical work. But now, for the first time in a long while, he saw in them what his uncle must have seen: the capacity to build, to mend, to finish what was started. Outside, the light softened into evening. The fields shimmered once more, the horizon trembling in heat and color. Inside the house, everything felt still, but not dead. Beneath his feet, in that hidden chamber, the city waited patiently, its tiny lamps dark but ready, its unbuilt streets traced in pencil like promises. Lucas stood quietly, letting the weight of it settle inside him. He did not yet know when or how he would begin, but he knew that he would. He could already see the new streets forming in his mind, the houses rising, the park blooming with light. His uncle had left him more than a home. He had left him a heartbeat, still waiting to be continued. And as the last light of day slipped beyond the ridge, a single beam of it found the crack beneath the basement door, glinting faintly against the floorboards as if the sun itself were reaching in to touch the world his uncle had built below. The following week passed in a rhythm unlike any Lucas had known before. The house, once still and airless, had begun to breathe again. Every morning he descended into the basement after a simple breakfast, lantern in hand, the cool air greeting him like a familiar friend. The hidden room no longer felt secret or strange. It felt purposeful, as if it had been waiting all these years for someone to come back and understand what it truly was. Down there, surrounded by the scent of pine, glue, and dust, he began to piece together the story that had been silently preserved in every wire, every note, and every unfinished edge of the model city. He spent his first mornings opening the old boxes stacked along the walls. Most of them contained organized chaos, old blueprints, spare bulbs, neatly wrapped coils of copper wire, gears and pulleys, tiny painted figurines of people frozen mid-motion. The deeper he dug, the more personal the discoveries became. At the bottom of one box, he found a bundle of folded papers bound with a rubber band, yellowed but carefully kept. When he spread them out on the workbench, his breath caught. They were his own childhood drawings. The streets were drawn in clumsy lines of crayon, the buildings colored unevenly, trees shaded in green scribbles. On one corner stood a hand-drawn park labeled Lucas's Hill, and beside it a river crossed by a crooked bridge. The same bridge appeared in the miniature city before him now, only here it was built with perfect precision. Metal girders painted gray, lights placed exactly where his young imagination had once drawn them. He touched the edge of one paper, tracing his own shaky signature at the bottom, and for the first time in years, he laughed quietly to himself. It wasn't the laughter of amusement, but of recognition. His uncle had kept every one of these sketches. He began comparing the childish maps with the actual model. The resemblance was astonishing. The city his uncle built was not a random project of engineering. It was an evolution of their shared imagination, refined and perfected through time. Every building, every curve of road, even the arrangement of parks mirrored something from those early afternoons spent on the living room floor. It was as if Harold had taken the fleeting visions of a child and transformed them into a permanent world, a place where those dreams could continue existing long after both of them had left them behind. The notebooks on the shelves deepened the sense of connection. Lucas read them late into the night, sitting under the soft light of the lantern while the basement hummed faintly with the electricity of the circuits he had restored. The notes were precise, but between the lines of technical calculation, emotion bled through. If it's worth building, one page read, it's worth building slowly. Another, Lucas used to say a city should smile. Maybe that's why he always added parks. And on a later page, almost as an afterthought, the sentence that stopped him cold. I hope he finds his way back to this someday. He closed the notebook gently, his eyes stinging. His uncle had not merely left behind a model, he had left behind faith. Every careful motion, every sleepless night bent over this miniature landscape had been an act of love disguised as craft. The realization settled over Lucas with a weight both comforting and unbearable. He was no longer simply inheriting a home. He was inheriting the unfinished heartbeat of another man's purpose. Day by day, he began repairing and restoring what time had dulled. Some lights flickered, their wiring corroded with age. He replaced them one by one. The gears that drove the tiny cars had grown stiff with dust. He cleaned and oiled them until they moved again, with smooth precision. He discovered that some of the miniature houses had lost their roofs, their glue long since dried to powder. Patiently, he reattached them, sanding and repainting the pieces in colors his uncle had noted in the margins of his plans. As his hands worked, his thoughts drifted often to the man he remembered from childhood. Harold had always built with a kind of reverence. When something broke, he never rushed to fix it. He would sit quietly first, studying the problem until it spoke to him. Everything mechanical tells you what it needs, he had once said, his voice soft as he sanded a tiny bridge beam. You just have to listen long enough. Lucas found himself repeating those words aloud sometimes, almost unconsciously as he worked. And as he did, he realized that something inside him was beginning to shift. It wasn't just the model that was coming back to life, it was him. The numb routine of his old life in Denver felt distant now, replaced by a sense of deliberate movement. The discipline of repair, the slow rhythm of restoration, filled him with a peace he hadn't known in years. He began keeping his own notes, writing in the margins of his uncle's notebooks with a different ink, documenting the small victories of each day. Streetlight number 42 rewired, train line recalibrated, park fountain repaired. But beneath the technical entries, another layer formed, quiet reflections about purpose, about legacy, about what it meant to finish something someone else had started. Outside the house, the world continued in its usual silence. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and he saw almost no one. Occasionally, a mail truck passed on the distant road, or a pair of deer crossed the field near the porch. Evenings were long, filled with the sound of cicadas and wind pressing softly against the windows. Yet inside, the house was alive in a different way. Its wooden bones carried the faint tremor of electricity from below, the almost imperceptible rhythm of the tiny world in the basement. It was as though the real and miniature cities had become mirrors of one another, one large still and fading, the other small, vibrant and growing stronger each day. Lucas's transformation was gradual but visible in every gesture. He moved through the rooms now with a sense of belonging, not intrusion. The dust no longer felt like neglect but memory, something sacred he was helping preserve. He started sleeping in the upstairs bedroom, the one that had belonged to his uncle. Each morning before breakfast, he would stand at the window and watch the first light sweep across the valley, wondering if Harold had ever done the same. Then, with his coffee cooling on the desk, he would descend once more into the basement, ready to continue the work. The more he built, the more he remembered. The scent of paint reminded him of summers in the workshop when his uncle would let him mix colors. The sound of small gears turning brought back the soft whir of the model trains they used to race on rainy afternoons. Sometimes he caught himself smiling for no reason other than the quiet joy of recognition. The past wasn't gone. It had simply been waiting for him to return and listen. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and the room filled with the amber glow of dusk, he noticed something he hadn't before. On the back wall of the hidden room, nearly obscured by years of dust, hung a single-frame photograph. He wiped the glass with his sleeve and looked closely. It was a picture of Harold and a much younger version of himself, sitting on the floor surrounded by Lego bricks, both of them laughing. Behind them on the table stood the first version of the city, a clumsy grid of plastic houses and bridges, imperfect but full of life. He stared at it for a long time, the sound of the miniature motors purring softly around him. That, he realized, was the seed from which all of this had grown. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, the photograph resting on his knees, thinking about the strange loop of time that had brought him back here. He was no longer the child in the picture, but he was also not the man who had left Denver weeks ago. Somewhere between the two, something new was forming, someone who understood that the value of creation lay not in finishing quickly, but in caring deeply. When dawn finally came, he stood, placed the photograph gently back on the wall, and went downstairs. The basement welcomed him with its cool air and quiet hum. He turned on the lights of the model city and watched them flicker to life one by one. The streets glowed, the cars began their endless loop, and the train crossed its bridge just as it always had. But now when Lucas looked at the unfinished sector, he didn't see emptiness. He saw possibility. He took a notebook from the shelf, opened to a blank page, and began sketching. His lines were surer than they had ever been as he drafted new buildings, new streets, a park that mirrored the one he had once drawn as a child. For the first time, the act of drawing didn't feel like looking backward. It felt like breathing forward, like continuing a conversation that had never really stopped. The day stretched on, the lights shifting across the workshop floor. When he finally stepped back from the table, the page before him was filled with shapes, measurements, and penciled notes, a plan for completion. The house above him was silent except for the soft creak of settling wood, but beneath it, the city pulsed with quiet life, waiting patiently for his hands to finish what love had begun. And as the evening drew near, Lucas stood in the center of the small room, surrounded by the hum of wires, the scent of pine, and the soft light of 100 tiny windows. He realized then that his uncle hadn't built this city to be a monument or a memory. He had built it to be continued, to remind someone that creation, real creation, was an inheritance that never truly ends. By the time spring settled into the valley, the house no longer felt abandoned. The wind still moved through the cracks in the walls, but it carried a different sound now, a murmur of life rather than decay. Down in the basement, The faint whir of restored circuits joined the quiet rhythm of the house's old bones. Lucas had fallen into a steady routine. Each morning began with the slow ritual of unlocking the basement door, setting down a mug of coffee beside the blueprints, and switching on the overhead lamp whose circle of light revealed the waiting miniature world. It greeted him like a living thing, and he found himself greeting it in return. The unfinished section of the city drew his attention more each day. At first, he had only stared at it, sketching possible layouts in his notebook, uncertain how to begin. Now, after months of studying his uncle's methods, he was ready. He had learned the language of the place, the logic behind its proportions, the precision of its order, the harmony of its systems. The city was more than a model. It was a philosophy rendered in wood and wire. Every street had been built with thought for light, balance, and purpose. Harold had designed even the simplest alleyway as if it mattered to someone who might one day walk there, even in miniature. Lucas felt a responsibility to match that standard. He cleared the unfinished corner first, dusting off the plywood until the faint pencil lines of streets reappeared. The blueprint for this section lay half-folded on the workbench, annotated in his uncle's careful hand. "Parks first," one note read. "Life grows from the center outward." It seemed like good advice for cities and for people. Lucas started there. He measured out the space for the park, cut thin strips of wood for the perimeter, and built the tiny walkways that crossed it like veins. He carved benches from scrap material, sanded them smooth, and painted them a muted brown. The smell of paint filled the room, faint but comforting. He worked slowly, refusing to rush, as Harold would have. As the days passed, he lost all sense of time. Outside, rain came and went. The hills turned green, then golden again. But Lucas noticed only the soft ticking of tools, the hum of transformers, the delicate sound of his own breath while he worked. He bought supplies from a small hardware store in the nearest town, where the cashier, an elderly woman with bright eyes, started recognizing him and asking about his project. He never gave much detail, only that it was something left behind by his uncle. "That kind of work keeps the heart steady," she once said, handing him a box of screws. "You finish it right, and you'll feel him there beside you." Back in the basement, those words proved true. The more he built, the more it felt as though Harold's presence had never left. He could almost hear his uncle's voice, the calm, deliberate tone he used when explaining why things had to be measured twice, or why wires needed to be twisted in a certain direction. Lucas found himself talking aloud sometimes as he worked, answering questions that were never asked. There was comfort in that quiet dialogue across time. The park came together first. He added small trees made from wire and sponge, a fountain with a ring of light around its base, and a single bench at the center that faced toward the rest of the city. When he finished painting the last detail, he turned on the power, and the fountain flickered to life, its simulated water catching the glow of surrounding lamps. The sight brought a smile to his face, and for the first time, tears to his eyes. It was beautiful not because it was perfect, but because it was alive. After that, he began the surrounding streets. Using the same materials his uncle had used, he built rows of small houses, each with its own character. He designed a schoolhouse with red walls and a clock above the door, remembering how Harold had once told him that every city needed a place for children to dream. He wired the tiny windows so they glowed softly, suggesting warmth inside. Next came a small workshop with a sign above the door that read Morgan & Son Models. The lettering was so small he had to paint it with a magnifying lens. But when he stepped back and saw it shining in the lamplight, he laughed softly. It felt like a secret handshake between generations. Not every moment was easy. There were days when the wiring failed, when the lights dimmed or shorted out, and he would spend hours tracing the problem, hands blackened with graphite and dust. Sometimes frustration rose in him like a storm, but he remembered Harold's words. "Everything mechanical tells you what it needs. You just have to listen long enough." So he listened to the faint click of gears, the soft resistance of switches, the hum that wavered when a connection was wrong. He learned patience, not as endurance, but as respect. As the final week of work approached, the city was nearly complete. Only one structure remained unfinished, the last house at the edge of the park. Its foundation was laid, the walls framed, but the roof remained off, open to the air. Lucas spent an evening cutting and fitting the final pieces, gluing them carefully and painting the tiny shingles by hand. When he was done, he placed a single miniature figure beside the door, a man holding what looked like a map, gazing toward the park. He had found it in a box of spare figurines, and something about its posture felt right. It was, perhaps, Harold himself, watching the city as it came alive again. When everything was in place, Lucas stepped back from the table. The basement was dim except for the circle of light from the overhead lamp. The city beneath it looked impossibly real. He reached for the master switch on the control panel, hesitated for a moment, then pressed it down. The transformation was immediate. The entire model shimmered to life as one seamless organism. Lights flared in every window. Cars began their quiet glide through the streets. The train emerged from its tunnel, crossing the new district with perfect timing. The fountain in the park spun its ring of light, reflecting in the glass windows of the nearby buildings. The whole system pulsed gently, synchronized, alive. Lucas watched in silence, overwhelmed by the beauty of it. For the first time, the city was whole. He leaned closer, listening to the soft hum that filled the room. It was like the heartbeat of a living creature, steady and calm. The sound wrapped around him, blending with his own breathing until he couldn't tell where the machine ended, and he began. He didn't cheer, didn't speak. He simply stood there, eyes shining, feeling the quiet satisfaction of something finished, not for glory, but for meaning. Hours passed before he realized how late it was. The lamp above the workbench had grown warm, casting a golden halo over the miniature landscape. Lucas turned off the power and sat in the old chair near the door. Even in darkness, the afterimage of the glowing city remained behind his eyes, soft and lingering. He felt no emptiness now, no sadness that the work was done. Completion, he realized, was not an ending. It was a beginning of understanding. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, bright and clean. He walked outside for the first time in weeks and stood on the porch, feeling the crisp air on his face. The hills stretched wide before him, pale green from spring rain. For the first time, he noticed how the landscape itself resembled the contours of the model below, roads cutting across slopes, trees clustering near the stream. It struck him how closely his uncle's miniature mirrored the real world, as if he had tried to capture not just the shape of a town, but the feeling of being part of something greater. Lucas returned inside and stood for a long while at the top of the basement stairs. The faint hum of the circuit still lingered, even though the power was off. It was a comforting sound now, not mechanical but human. He descended once more, slowly, and turned the switch again. The little city awakened beneath his gaze, perfect and whole. He sat down at the workbench, folded his hands, and allowed himself a small smile. He knew that when people spoke of inheritance, they meant property, value, something that could be listed or sold. But what Harold had left him was different. It was the belief that beauty could exist quietly, that patience was a form of love, and that building something true, no matter how small, could keep the world from falling apart, even if only in one room beneath an old house. When he finally shut off the lights that evening, he stood at the doorway for a long moment, looking back at the silent city. Its miniature streets were dark now, but he knew that life still lingered there, waiting. He touched the frame of the door and whispered softly, "It's finished." And though no voice answered, the silence that filled the room felt complete, as if someone had heard him and was content. The morning after he finished the city, Lucas woke before dawn. The silence inside the house was heavy and absolute, the kind that carried the faint echo of what had been done the night before. For a few seconds, he didn't move. He lay still, listening, waiting for the sense of completion to settle into him like warmth. But what came instead was a kind of still wonder, a quiet awe that left him wide awake. He rose, pulled on his flannel shirt, and made his way downstairs. The boards creaked softly under his steps, the sound blending with the distant murmur of the wind outside. When he reached the basement door, he paused. It was strange how something so ordinary, just a door, paint cracked at the hinges, could conceal an entire world. He opened it and stepped inside, flipping the light switch. The bulbs hummed to life overhead, bathing the narrow stairs in gold. As he descended, the familiar scent of oil, Glue and dust welcomed him like an old friend. The city lay before him in perfect stillness. Without the lights in motion, it seemed almost asleep. But even in that quiet state, it was beautiful. Lucas stood for a while, looking over it, remembering the months of work that had brought it back to life. Every piece bore his uncle's signature, the patience in the design, the humility of craft, the affection hidden in small details. But now, within that same frame, he could see pieces of himself as well. The streets were his work as much as Harold's, the new park his vision of what his uncle had begun. He turned the main switch on the control panel. The familiar hum spread through the room, and one by one the miniature lights began to glow. The streets filled with movement, the fountain shimmered, the tiny workshop with the Morgan and Son sign gleamed beneath its lamplight. The scene unfolded with the slow grace of morning itself. Lucas felt something inside him loosen, an ease that had nothing to do with accomplishment and everything to do with belonging. For the first time, he wasn't just looking at the city as an object of inheritance or memory. He was looking at it as something alive, something that existed now not because of obligation, but because of care. His uncle had spent years building it in solitude, leaving behind a legacy of precision and love disguised as wires and glue. Now Lucas understood that his role was not only to finish it, but to protect it, to let it breathe, to give it a future. The decision came naturally. He didn't even need to think it through. The idea of selling the house, which had once seemed practical, now felt absurd. This place wasn't property, it was a living story. He could almost hear Harold's voice in the hum of the motors, reminding him that creation meant responsibility. He began making lists, small practical things at first. The wiring would need insulation to meet safety standards. The old wooden stairs to the basement were narrow and unsteady. They'd have to be reinforced. He wanted to add a railing for visitors. Because there would be visitors, he was sure of that now. The thought didn't frighten him. Instead, it filled him with quiet purpose. He imagined people stepping into the room for the first time, hearing the soft whir of the hidden city, leaning close to see the minute windows glowing in the dusk. They would see what Harold had built, what Lucas had continued, and they would understand that this was not about nostalgia, but about endurance, the way dreams could outlast those who dreamed them. Over the next few weeks, Lucas worked on transforming the basement into something more than a workshop. He installed new lighting overhead, soft but bright enough to illuminate every detail of the city. He cleaned the walls, patched the cracks, and built clear glass barriers around the table to protect the model without obscuring the view. He even printed small labels that explained the history of the project, nothing grand. Just a simple timeline and a brief note that read, "Built by Harold Morgan, completed by Lucas Morgan, in memory of shared dreams." When everything was ready, he took a series of photographs. The miniature city glowed beneath a camera lens like a constellation. He sent the pictures to a local community center in town, along with a short letter explaining his plan to open the basement as a small exhibit, the Morgan Workshop. A week later, he received a reply. They loved the idea. They would help him arrange a small opening for anyone who wanted to visit. The day the first visitors came, the sky was overcast and the air cool. A few cars parked near the gate, and Lucas watched from the porch as people stepped out. Locals mostly, a few curious hobbyists who had heard about the model through word of mouth. He welcomed them in quietly, guided them down to the basement, and watched their faces as the lights came on. Some smiled, some simply stared, the way people do when confronted with something unexpectedly human. No one spoke for a long time. The little city did all the talking. As they moved around the room, their reflections shimmered faintly in the glass cases, blending with the image of the miniature buildings and streets. A child pressed her hands to the railing, eyes wide, whispering something to her mother about how real it looked. An older man bent close to study the wiring beneath the platform, murmuring a quiet, beautiful work. Lucas didn't interrupt them. He just stood at the edge of the room, watching the city live through their wonder. It was no longer his alone, and that was exactly how it should be. When the visitors left, he lingered in the doorway of the basement. The lights still glowed on the model, soft and steady, reflecting off the tiny windows. He thought of Harold again, imagined him standing where he stood now, perhaps with the same faint smile. His uncle had believed that beauty didn't need an audience, that the act of building was enough. Lucas understood that now, but he also understood that sharing it didn't diminish its meaning. It completed it. Days passed and life settled into a peaceful rhythm. He took care of the house the way his uncle once had, patching leaks, sweeping the porch, trimming the weeds that grew along the path. Some mornings he received letters from people who had visited, thanking him for the experience. Others sent old photographs of Harold from years ago, found in local archives, as if the town itself was slowly remembering him. The model had become a bridge between past and present, carrying his uncle's work into the hands and hearts of strangers. Lucas began keeping the basement open on weekends, free to anyone who wanted to see it. Sometimes children came with notebooks, sketching their own miniature worlds. Sometimes older men came alone, standing silently for long stretches of time. Each visitor left something intangible behind, a quiet admiration, a sense of peace. The little city seemed to absorb it all, growing warmer, more alive with each passing week. Evenings were his favorite. When the last visitor had gone and the house stood empty again, Lucas would descend the stairs one final time before bed. He would turn on the lights of the model and sit in the old wooden chair, listening to the hum that had once been his uncle's heartbeat. The lights flickered across the tiny buildings, the streets shimmered with motion, and the fountain in the park glowed like a pulse at the city's center. One night, as he sat there with the lantern turned low, he noticed something he hadn't before. The faint reflection of the model shimmered in the glass barrier, and within it, his own face appeared, superimposed over the city like a ghost watching from above. It struck him then that he had become part of this place in more ways than one. The city would outlive him, just as it had outlived Harold, but a piece of both of them would always remain within it, in every wire, every street, every tiny light that refused to fade. He stood, turned off the switches, and watched the city's glow fade slowly, leaving only the echo of its hum in the silence. Before climbing the stairs, he whispered a quiet goodnight, a habit he had never intended to form, but couldn't bring himself to stop. Above ground, the moonlight lay across the valley like silver dust, and the wind carried the faint sound of the world breathing. Lucas paused at the window, looking out over the quiet fields. The house behind him was dark, the city beneath him sleeping, but he knew that both were alive in ways that couldn't be measured. The world Harold had built and the one Lucas had completed were no longer separate things. They were one continuous heartbeat, steady and enduring, glowing beneath the surface of time. And as he stood there, the first light of dawn touched the horizon, brushing the hills with gold. It spilled softly through the windows, reaching the floorboards above the basement door, and then farther still downward, through the narrow passage, until it met the little city below. The light filled its miniature streets, warmed the roofs of its tiny houses, and shimmered faintly over the park bench at the center, where a figure carved in Harold's image sat forever, watching over the city that now, truly and completely, lived. Here's a strong English call to action you can place at the end of the video. It sounds natural, cinematic, and encourages engagement on all fronts.